Hello, Bears AP US History class. The purpose of this video is to talk about Chapter 37 of the American Pageant, which the authors refer to as the American Zenith, a zenith being the pinnacle or top of America. I don't know if personally I would refer to the zenith as being the year 1963, although there are certainly some significant events that occur involving the Kennedy Presidency. So to give you a bit of context, this is a timeline of the 1960s, and we do have some major events brewing heading into 1963. So a lot of this was sparked in 1955 by the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which reversed Plessy versus Ferguson and led to a number of civil rights movement protests. This would also lead to sit-ins and other civil rights protests. But in 1960s, we start the decade with Kennedy defeating Nixon. This will lead to future civil rights protests in the next couple years. You have the Freedom Riders. You also have protests at Mississippi, at Ole Miss in 1962. 1963, though, things will kind of come to the head with the Birmingham protests, the March on Washington, and of course the John F. Kennedy assassination. So this presentation will take a close look at the Kennedy presidency and the civil rights movement of that time period. So would I refer to this as the American Zenith personally? No, but the authors of the pageant choosing to do so definitely shows a lot of credit towards the Kennedy presidency, which must be related to his viewpoints of civil rights and really the tragedy that surrounded it. So let's take a look at the Kennedy presidency. Besides civil rights, foreign policy kind of came to a head in a number of ways during the Kennedy presidency. First of all, there was the Berlin Wall crisis, where once again the Soviet Union threatened to shut down Berlin and would enact a wall that would separate the two portions of the city. This would escalate Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was also an incident very early in the Kennedy presidency involving Cuba, referred to as the Bay of Pigs, or sometimes referred to as the Bay of Pigs fiasco. The Soviet Union had established a communist country in Cuba, which was shocking because it was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This stands in contrast to things like the Truman Doctrine and ideas about containment. And even if you go further back, it would be a violation of ideas like the Monroe Doctrine. That being said, there was an attempted overthrow of the communist government of Cuba that, when President Kennedy took office, was to be enacted, where a number of freedom fighters in Miami were sent to Cuba to overthrow the government. And then what happened was these freedom fighters were less than successful, and when they hit the beaches, they were getting overturned by the Cuban government with Soviet assistance. And there was a call for an airstrike at that time for the United States to support the rebels. And Kennedy was concerned because he believed that this could lead to a wider conflict with the Soviet Union. So that being said, he did not call an airstrike, and that revolution, the Bay of Pigs, failed. Fast forward a few years later, the Soviet Union places a number of missiles with nuclear warheads on Cuba. And this becomes very alarming because, as you can see this chart below, it would put a number of these missiles just minutes away from striking American cities. This is potentially the closest we came in the Cold War to full-scale hot war. There was a lengthy standoff. The president enacted what he called a quarantine at that time of Cuba to prevent the missiles from spreading. He could not call it a blockade because that was a situation that could be considered an act of war. In the end, the Soviet Union relented and pulled their missiles, and shortly thereafter we pulled a number of missiles that we had stationed in Turkey, and there was a bit of de-escalation. So there's two interpretations of Kennedy's foreign policy Cold War actions. Some would give him a lot of credit for de-escalating conflict. Potentially Kennedy avoided World War III. Other people would say that he looked soft to the communists in a number of ways. That the situation in Berlin wasn't aggressive enough at stopping the Soviets. Some people would say that he should have sent air support to help the rebels in Cuba. Others would have said he should have attacked and bombed missile sites sooner in Cuba. It's difficult to judge, but there is a sense that the president may have avoided a war, in one opinion. By other people, looked a little soft towards communism. A few other incidents spurred up and were escalated during the Kennedy presidency. President Eisenhower, his predecessor, had warned about the existence of a military-industrial complex, which was just the sense that in the Cold War, with our renewed defense spending, the military-industrial complex showed an increasing amount of wealth and possibly a lot of political power as well. There was also the space race, which President Kennedy pushed for an initiative to send us to the moon, which would not be completed in his lifetime, but was a significant social program. And there was also a great number of protests in Vietnam involving a dictator that was anti-communist that we supported, and a communist overthrow that would overtake northern Vietnam and eventually lead to the Vietnam War. So Kennedy also continued our efforts in space, and he also avoided wide-scale conflict in the Vietnam, but also did send advisors. So it's kind of a mixed bag as to whether or not, Kennedy would or would not have got us involved in the Vietnam War. The authors of Pageant, I believe, take the approach that he avoided this sort of quagmire. There was also, on a foreign policy front, just because this comes up, a number of conflicts involving Israel. If you're not familiar with the background of Israel, following World War I, there was an effort known as Zionism to promote the creation of this state as a sanctuary for the Jewish people following the Holocaust. And basically the United States, with a little bit of British help, established this nation. But the problem being that many Muslim and Arab nations in the surrounding areas viewed that as an injustice and were particularly hostile to Israel. Fast forward this into the era of the Cold War, and people are picking sides. A lot of Middle Eastern states allied with the Soviet Union and were very anti-Israeli. So there was an incident known as the Suez Crisis, which they talk about in 1864, where Egypt was threatening Israel. Israel responded by capturing what is known as the Sinai Peninsula in eastern Egypt. The fact that this was allowed to happen angered a lot of Middle Eastern countries, and they would put pressure on the Western world by forming this cartel known as OPEC. OPEC is the organization of petroleum exporting countries, and they exert a lot of influence on the price of oil. There was also a situation in Iran where in Iran there was a leader who would be sort of an anti-communist. His name was Shah Pahlavi, I believe is how his name is pronounced. And the Shah of Iran was very anti-communist, so we supported him even though he was kind of he was a dictator and probably not the best guy, but at least he wasn't a communist. This would blow up in our faces in the 1970s. So even in the Kennedy administration, a number of proxy wars resulted in the Middle East. You had the Sinai Peninsula crisis. This is the first of a series of conflicts that would involve Israel and its neighbors in the 60s, 70s, and honestly, beyond. So let's get back to Kennedy back home. The election of Kennedy was interesting in a number of ways. It was really super close. This was an election of Kennedy versus Nixon, and there's even some criticism that Paget notes that there might have been a little bit of funny business involving Democratic machine politics. For example, in Illinois, it was noted that there was a number of dead voters that may have cast their votes in Illinois. But Kennedy does come out ahead, winning Texas and Illinois, which were critical states in that election. And although he did not really have a slam dunk and popular vote, he would win the electoral vote and defeat Nixon in 1960. Another thing that political analysts look at in 1960 was the role of television. That would show a growing influence in a lot of different ways. Television and consumerism was in its heyday in the 1960s, and this also had its impacts on the election. Now, Richard Nixon actually had been given credit for using television to his advantage earlier in his political career. When he was the vice president for Eisenhower, there was some criticism over bribery, and Nixon made a speech on TV known as the Checkers speech, where he talked about his dog Checkers and how he's a down-to-earth guy and basically tried to separate himself from these allegations. But in the 1960s, television would work against Richard Nixon, particularly in his debates against Kennedy. Frankly put, many people who watched the debate on TV just felt that Kennedy looked more vibrant, confident, and honest, where Nixon looked shifty-eyed. So, I put a couple pictures here of the televised debates, and you can see Nixon kind of looking angry there. He also, by a number of people, would look kind of pale and sort of sickly. Apparently, he did have a flu at the time of the debate, where Kennedy looked, bronzed and handsome and better on TV. Interestingly enough, the people who listened to the debate on the radio said that Nixon won the debates, but people watching the new technology of television said that Kennedy won. So, did Kennedy win this based off of the television? Well, based on how close these numbers were in these elections, maybe. So, basically, this reestablishes a rule that political leaders who adapt better to the new media tend to have better results in the election. So Kennedy for TV, much like his predecessor FDR, utilized fireside chats in the Great Depression, and how modern races mention more social media campaigns. Okay, but the big event of the 1960s would be the civil rights protests that were escalating. So 1955 was really the beginning of a major civil rights movement through the Supreme Court passage of Brown versus the Board of Education, which said that public schools that were segregated were no longer equal and would have to be desegregated. That being said, just because the law says that people had to desegregate does not mean that everybody would. So there's actually two terms that are utilized when we discuss segregation. The first one is de jure, and the second is de facto. So de jure basically means of the law, right? What does the letter of the law say? And Brown basically says you got to end school segregation. But the reality, or the de facto matter, was that segregation existed in many places across the country well after 1955. And so you see these protests occur where people are really challenging the systems, not just in schools, but in public places. One event that occurred in the Eisenhower presidency early on was the Little Rock 9 situation, where 9 students, Little Rock, Arkansas, would eventually be escorted by federal troops to class forcing the Brown decision into happening. There were other social protests that were happening in the 1960s, such as the Montgomery bus boycott, which would raise Dr. King to prominence. And all of this would play a factor in the 1960s election, as John F. Kennedy is trying to play cool with Democrats in the South and win votes, and it's really unsure where he stands in this whole matter, where civil rights protesters like Martin Luther King Jr. Are seeking, desegregation. And many historians point John F. Kennedy's beginnings as being a pro-civil rights leader being actually before he's elected in 1960 as a senator and presidential candidate. He makes a call to the governor of Georgia asking for assistance in freeing Martin Luther King Jr. from a jail there. And this phone call would gain him support from Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers, who would begin to campaign and see JFK as a potential, pro-civil rights candidate. Also during the president's time, there was the Birmingham protests, which were famous for severe acts against many young people who were trying to desegregate the public facilities in Birmingham, Alabama, which Dr. King referred to as the most segregated city of the South. So you have a lot of interesting photography and video coming from this. This protests are famous for spraying people with fire hoses, the sicking of dogs on people. One of the other significant things about the Birmingham protests was the number of young people involved. A lot of the first civil rights protesters were arrested, including Dr. King, in the Birmingham City Jail. And to continue these efforts, they turned to a lot of high school age students who continued the civil rights protests of Birmingham. Okay, so the Birmingham protest would also speak to a lot to the power of television, and protests such as these would lead to the creation of a number of bills, such as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which would start to take down public segregation, and the Voting Rights Act would finally abolish such things as the literacy test that had been in place since Reconstruction. So Kennedy was seen as a vital aspect of these of promoting these laws. But it should really be stated that these movements were beyond the president. Like, John F. Kennedy didn't get the Civil Rights Act passed. The civil rights protesters did. But that's one reason why 1963 is considered the zenith, because we were in such a, hot debate about these topics. Now let's take a look at the other side of civil rights for the moment. A famous moment of the Kennedy presidency involves the governor of Alabama, his name George Wallace. George Wallace was a champion for segregation, and you can click and read his speech in the PowerPoint about how he promoted segregation now, segregation forever. If you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, this scene is recreated with Forrest Gump sneaking his way past Governor Wallace. But basically what happened was this university, which is one of several examples in this era, was protesting federal guidelines to desegregate. The governor stood in the doorway, refused to allow this to happen, and basically argued that it was a state right issue. Another quote from George Wallace is, "This nation was never meant to be a unit of one, but a unit of the many. That is the exact reason our freedom-loving forefathers established the states, so as to divide the rights and powers among the states, ensuring that no central power could gain master government control." Now, while I'm not an apologist for George Wallace, George Wallace was definitely uprooting systemic segregation and racism. This does kind of point towards an interesting shift in history. So if we look at the role of federal government versus state government, Many of the founding fathers saw the federal government or the national government as being the true threat to liberty. Anti-federalists believed that the king had been their greatest threat to liberty, and in the future, the federal government would be the institute that they would have to fear, taking their basic rights away. Anti-federalists fought for the Bill of Rights. Anti-federalists fought for the five freedoms of speech, more separation of power and things like that. And really the role was to limit the federal government. A lot of that would change, however, with the creation of the 14th Amendment that says that every constitutional right that the U.S. Constitution guarantees must be protected, must be given and granted to every citizen, including by their state. And we saw this becoming an issue during Reconstruction, but during the Civil Rights Movement, this will come to a head as well, because in order to ensure these basic rights across the 1960s, we see the federal government exerting more powers to protect individual freedoms, protecting citizens from their state. This is the photograph above is showing the 101st Airborne escorting students from Little Rock into class. The image below will show Lyndon Baines Johnson discussing with Dr. King and civil rights leaders the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which would basically guarantee that the 15th Amendment was being enforced by states. So there is a really interesting switch that happens with the passage of the 14th Amendment during Reconstruction. Basically, the founding fathers worried that the national government was the threat to liberty. In Reconstruction and continuing into the Civil Rights Movement, it really looked like individual states were the ones hampering individual liberty by their refusal to desegregate and their voter suppression that took place. Okay, so let's talk about John F. Kennedy for a second. This chapter really points at Kennedy as being a significant leader, and I believe that he was. There's a number of reasons why an argument for John F. Kennedy being a great president could be made. First of all, he handled a Cuban Missile Crisis, which could have averted World War III. There were a lot of hawks, war promoters who wanted to see that war happen at that time and believed in the inevitability of World War III, and Kennedy really kind of put that down. So if it weren't for Kennedy, would there have been World War III? Maybe. Okay, that's definitely something worth concern. He also avoided a Vietnam War, a Vietnam quagmire. He supported the Civil Rights Movement and is held in high regards by many African Americans in that era. He managed to mobilize the National Guard, including James Meredith being protected in Ole Miss, once again in Alabama with George Wallace. And he was supportive of King in the Birmingham protests. And so by a lot of people, JFK is credited for his support of the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were progressed in his time, although Kennedy did not live to see them. But maybe Kennedy is a bit overblown in his stay. I mean, he was not president very long. Critics of his could say that he did kind of drop the ball with Cuba. Bay of Pigs was a disaster. Had we overthrown Cuban government sooner, the Cuban Missile Crisis might not have happened. Some people say that his stance towards the Soviet Union on Berlin was soft. And many hawks might say that he was in general soft on communism, which would lead to some wider conflicts in the future. Although some people credit him for avoiding Vietnam, he did send the initial advisors, and we would get involved in a wider conflict in the next presidency. So there's generally a sense that, maybe we would have got involved even if Kennedy had lived longer. Although Kennedy is given a lot of credit for civil rights, Lyndon Baines Johnson is really the one who finishes it. In a lot of sources, Kennedy was actually reluctant to wade into civil rights because he had such a narrow victory and was looking towards re-election. So some people say that, Lyndon Baines Johnson is really the one we can credit with the Voting Rights Act. Some would argue that George Wallace has a point, that the handling of schools is not really clearly defined in the Constitution. Thus, by the 10th Amendment, there are supposed to be powers reserved to the states. Now, unfortunately, these were being used to prop up a racist system, and one can argue that for the better good of the country, the federal government needed to intervene, but that's also not necessarily part of the Constitution. And lastly, Kennedy was assassinated before a lot of the civil rights movement achieved desegregation goals. And it is possible that through nature of his assassination, that he is given a lot more credit than maybe is due. His one term sort of elevates his legacy. So he gets a little bit of a bump by the tragedy that ended his presidency. Okay. I'd be remiss not to talk about the end of the Kennedy presidency at this point in time. The JFK assassination is a deeply interesting event in history, and it does have a lot of ramifications. Now, according to the official story, it was enacted by a lone gunman by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, who acted alone and took it upon himself to assassinate the president. And using a bolt-action rifle, he fired 3 shots from the 3rd floor of a book depository in Dallas, Texas. And 2 of those shots hit the president, 1 missed. 1 shot did a variety of wounds to the president and the governor, and the 2nd shot, I believe, is the one that missed, and the 3rd shot is indicated as the headshot. Now, strangely enough, the president's assassin was picked up later, and then the president's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, said that he was a patsy, and in transport from one facility, but the police department, to I believe the jail, he was assassinated himself. So the assassin of the president died shortly after being apprehended. This left a lot of questions of the official story. A federal commission was formed. The Warren Report basically confirmed the facts. It was a lone gunman. But there have been a lot of questions that were raised, including a House committee that says that they believe that it was the work of a conspiracy. And so this leads to a lot of conjecture about the events itself. So there is the Oswald situation. There are a number of theories that circulate it. One thing that people point at is there's an actual film of the president's assassination called the Zapruder film. So they actually have the moments where the president is shot. Now, by a number of experts, including the film of the 1990s by Oliver Stone, JFK, they point towards the fact that the president was shot from behind. Okay, so like the motorcade had passed by the book depository before the headshot was fired, and he was hit in the back of the skull with a shot. This, according to a lot of people, would jerk your head forward. But if you watch the Zapruder film, the president's head actually gets knocked back. And so this has led to a number of people to believe that there was a team of shooters involved in the president's assassination. If there is a team, this basically speaks to the idea that there was some sort of cover-up about the president's assassination. Some even believe that since there was a cover-up, this indicates a large degree of conspiracy in of itself. Like, why is there a cover-up? It's very difficult to say. Now, unfortunately, there's other weird circumstances about the Kennedy assassination. For example, like we could do forensics tests and study his brain and, look at the exit wounds of that. Well, apparently there's a very rushed autopsy that occurred. And in the course of that, apparently they lost the president's brain. Yeah. So, what happened to John F. Kennedy? It's very difficult to say. Depending on what source you look at, it was a act of a lone gunman. There are numerous theories out there, and I'll leave that for yourself. But whether or not you believe that there was a cover-up or not, this distrust of government would definitely circulate into the later 60s as we get involved in the Vietnam War. Following the president's assassination, we would have the swearing in of Lyndon B. Johnson. This is Johnson next to Mrs. Kennedy being sworn in Air Force One. Do I think personally that there was a conspiracy to cover up the president's death? I say 60% no, 40% possibly. And if we have a chance, I will talk to you about the nature of why that might be the case. But so, in the long run, Kennedy, was it the American Zenith? Well, Pageant seems to think so. They would credit his action in foreign policy, his promotion of civil rights programs, and finally the idea that his death being such an event would, solidify his place in history. But of course, I'll leave that to you. We will talk about this when we can.